Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan, and this is Forlorn Hobbies. Hello and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I thought I would have a bit of a ramble about how, as a gamer that dabbles in many systems, many historical eras, fantasy, sci-fi, how I kind of keep a good balance and on top of things. Well, at least try to. When it comes to starting new projects and trying not to be overwhelmed. Now, I've recently just got back off of holiday, and the inconsiderate parent that I am, it was obviously full of historical and cultural things for my poor wife and children to enjoy and experience, whilst I just soaked up all that inspiration from the artwork, the buildings, and just further pursuing general historical facts from that specific area in Italy that we went to in Florence, and the wealth of inspiration that provided me. I think every time I looked at something, I would have the thoughts of a new project coming to life in my head and just taking over everything else. Now, instead of panic buying and rushing through everything, I have kind of implemented recently a system of, should we say, willpower? I mean, willpower is a very loose term because as a gamer with as big a pile of shame as I have, willpower is pretty much non-existent. However, I have started to kind of reflect on several points that kind of help me have a better sense of direction for my hobby journey. Now, just taking my trip to Florence as an example in terms of my hobby ideas, there were several specific areas of history which leapt out to me. Obviously, you're in Italy, Romans all the way. There is a wealth of Roman art and statues. Uh, the gallery in the Uffizi with all the busts of the emperors and their spouses and close relations. My eldest has a slightly weird obsession with Caligula, so every time we saw Caligula, we had to stop and let him have his photo taken with him, and I do not know which expression looked more sinister, the pose and stoicness of Caligula, or the grinning evilness of my child. I will leave that up to the future to determine who becomes more mad, should we say. Um, Moving on from the obvious Romans, we have the development of Florence itself, the conflict between the Guelphs and Ghibellines, which is a fascinating back and forth kind of conflict, whether you were pro Holy Roman Empire or pro kind of church and independence with the Catholic seat and papacy. The pettiness of it is fascinating. The fact that you have the red lily on a white background for Florence's emblem is literally because the winning side went, I don't want the other one's emblem, and it would swap between the white lily on a red background and a red lily on a white background for depending on who was prominent and in control in that kind of era. And then you obviously move a bit further forwards. You have the rise of the Medici, the Italian Wars. Now, side note, the TV series Medici is very fanciful in its kind of liberty taking, should we say, but it certainly stokes those fires of your inspiration and focuses on like the initial kind of conflicts, and that the conflict between the papacy, Naples, and Florence, as well as kind of hinting at Milanese and Venetian support. So it gives you a real flavour of that kind of Italian divisions in that era. So again, that's something that I am particularly focusing on. And then we can move a little bit further on. We obviously have Napoleonic Wars, with the Florence or Tuscany in that matter being a significant Habsburg territory that was wrestled from them by Napoleon, being the core, one of the core territories in the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy. And then moving further forwards, you also have the wars of like the Italian unification with Garibaldi, and Florence itself was the capital briefly of the Kingdom of Italy before Rome was finally seized and joined into the territories, obviously replacing Florence and Turin as the capitals. You could also look at the Second World War as an inspiration for Florence. A lot of the artwork was hoarded by the Nazis and taken, and all the bridges except for the Ponte Vecchio were destroyed to prevent the advancing Allies from having a good chance of taking Florence and recapturing it until the Nazis were forced to withdraw. So there is a huge wealth of rabbit holes, hobby projects to pursue just from this one trip. Now, realistically, I only have so many free seconds and minutes in the day, so I need to kind of think smartly about how I go about this, otherwise nothing will get done. And that's not even before I consider my already ongoing projects and the like. So I need a few measures to kind of, so I can get the most enjoyment out of this and completing a project. To start with, I kind of impose a kind of sense of realisticness to my kind of ideas. I look at what areas most stand out to me from the selected kind of initial brainwaves, so to speak. Now, each kind of area has its own strengths, it has its weaknesses, and we should get onto that as we go along. But as a rule, although I find modern history interesting, I feel like, it's a man with a gun. There's not a lot of difference, so to speak, unless you want to get into all the nitty gritty kind of this type of rifle, this make of tank, etc. I kind of look at that quite blankly and just go, it's an infantryman, it's a tank. So from a gaming perspective, I don't really play much modern warfare, and if I did, it's in 1/300 scale, so it's not hugely useful in terms of kind of seeing this project or envisioning that project going forward, so I can safely rule it out, even though it is a fascinating bit of history. So, and again, the Romans, I'm absolutely fascinated with the Romans. I studied them at college and for my A levels, even taking extra classics to pursue that even further. However, I can also rule them out because they're an auto include. They've been in the works for a long time, so I don't need to have another project specifically focused on this era where I've already got other ideas. So that leaves us with the kind of 11th, 12th century Florence with the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Again, it's fascinating to read, but I don't really see the practicalities of it on the tabletop. It might suit a skirmish game, but it's basically just more of the same. So that leaves us with the Italian Wars of the 15th and 16th centuries, the Napoleonic era, and the Reunification Wars, as these are projects that are interesting, and going forwards, I can see myself having these collections. The next thing that I consider is the size of the project ahead of me. So, for example, if we are looking at whether it's a skirmish game or whether it's going to be a full on kind of um, corp brigade level kind of game, and then what kind of rule set will suit that specific project. Now, the three projects I have identified for this specific kind of trail of thought are all quite large scale engagements. So you'd be looking at taking the Warlord Games systems, for example. You'd be looking at maybe Hail Caesar or Pike and Shot, depending on what time frame your Italian Wars project would be. You're looking at Black Powder for both the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy and um, the Italian Reunification Wars. So it's a very large scale kind of investment, as well as you also have to consider whether there are going to be people that are also interested in that era. Now, I'm quite lucky that I have Tim from Napoleonic Wargamer as my regular kind of gaming buddy, so our interests are quite often aligned, and we can kind of look at the projects and go, oh, I like this kind of time era. Would you like to do this battle? And then we'll be like, oh, yeah, that sounds interesting. So, a perfect example of that is the Battle of Razin, where Tim is working on I want to say Bavarians for that, whilst I'm loosely following the Austrian Warbat to one day see that happen. But you also need to consider whether you are prepared to have it as just a collection, so you're not really going to play with it, but you build it to obviously play with it, but with limited opponents, or whether you will be willing to do both sides of the conflict so that you can kind of use it to introduce new players to that era. So, looking loosely at the three options, the Italian Wars is quite spread out. It's kind of got a reasonable interest and multi-use for your miniatures and your armies that you're going to create. The Napoleonic Wars obviously has a huge interest for historical gamers, so that's another safe bet. Whereas the Reunification Wars are very kind of niche within kind of gaming groups. I know the Yorkshire Gamer has done a fantastic Reunification Wars project, which is probably given it a bit more kind of forefront to people's minds, especially if they're in those kind of circles and follow his group on Facebook and see him at various shows. But from the kind of methodology that I've put into my thought process, it's at this point that I would probably put that kind of idea for the Reunification Wars on the kind of back burner. I wouldn't rule it out, but that's certainly putting it below the other two in terms of my justification process for a new project. I'd then move on to kind of start thinking about the actual cost and availability of the project. Now, in brigade and division or core base level games, it can get very expensive and very large scaled with dozens of battalions on either side. Um, so I kind of take time to kind of envision what I expect or what I imagine the force I want to collect is going to be, and then I can fit it in as like a kind of element of a wider engagement, should we say. So, I mean, I was inspired by the Seventh Son Crusades campaign, where they had very small retinues of maybe no more than 10 units that formed part of a larger kind of system, and I think that works really well. And following that kind of technique, should we say, allows me to kind of envision a smaller but more unified and structured force. So, if you take the Italian Wars, for example, you can have a couple of ranged units, a couple of melee units, and then a couple of pike blocks supported by some cavalry and some kind of artillery. And it looks like an army, it feels like an army, but it's not a huge time consumption of playing with 10, you know, 15, 20 units. So it's looking at a realistic project as well. Now, looking at the ranges available, the Perrys do a great kind of late medieval, early Renaissance kind of War of the Roses range. They also have their European range that's attached to that, which does focus primarily on the Italians and the Swiss. So there's plenty of good quality miniatures available for that. And then obviously with the Napoleonic era, the Kingdom of Italy is essentially French in white. So there is an abundance of miniatures from dozens of manufacturers for that era as well. Now, going back to the reunification wars, there are some miniatures out there, but they are very hard to come by, and it will end up with a lot of kind of conversion work. I think American Zouaves are very good basis for some of the units as well, but again, that's going to be extra time and effort. So I think it's at this stage in my deliberation process that I would eliminate that project as a possibility. Now, before fully committing to one of these projects, there are two final kind of stages that I ask myself. The first being, what will the paint scheme kind of look like, and whether I can realistically see myself painting X amount of models that way. So the Napoleonic Italians, for example, are white with lots of decorative kind of linings and and stuff on the uniform of like greens and reds. Now, it's a straightforward kind of colour scheme. It won't take me overly long to do a model, but is that paint scheme engaging enough for me when I'm already painting a dozen or so battalions of Austrians that are also white? It's not really going to spark my drive to paint something. I like to have different projects on the go at the same time, so I can have a variety of paints and So it's not just the same thing over and over again. So like if I'm painting Austrians, I'm painting lots of white and stuff like that. I'll then want to swap to be painting something different, like even if it's just painting a couple of knights or something like that, just to mix up the enjoyment for me. So it's always engaged rather than, oh, I just need to paint another 100 of these and carry on and just really not enjoy that process, because I find that if I do that, it then puts me in a bit of a rut, and then I lose my productivity levels for like a month or so, and then I find myself starting to be detached from the hobby a bit. So, moving on to the Italian Wars, there's less uniformity in that, and there's a lot more variety. So, even within the project, I can then use my kind of methods of alternating to be able to keep my enjoyment levels higher. So, I think that the Italian Wars is probably the most likely of these projects that I have been talking about for me to go ahead with at a later point if I'm still interested in that era. Now, this has been something that's been on my mind for a while because I've been to Italy quite a few times in the last year or so. So it's not something that's gone away and kind of is on a whim. It's something that's slowly developing in my mind as a project, and I'm quite happy with how I've approached this in the terms of like, normally I'll just be like, oh, this is a great idea. I'm just going to buy it, and then I'll buy the whole project, and then it will just sit on my shelf for months. I mean, I've had some projects sitting there for years. That's how kind of, spontaneous my previous purchasing has been and my inspirations. So a part of this channel, so to speak, is to kind of document my thought processes and to make me really think about where I go with each project, thinking about not only oh, that's going to look cool, or oh, I want to do that, but looking at why, looking at the background, kind of immersing myself in the kind of the journey from the initial thought process and the reasoning behind it all the way through to the completed project. Finally, I just want to talk about kind of balancing multiple projects in general. Now, I find it kind of quite easy to balance projects because I'm a bit of a butterfly, whereas I'll be like, oh, I'll paint some Middle Earth today, I'll finish them, and then I'll move on to painting a unit for Heresy or Epic or a battalion of infantry for Napoleonics. And then I kind of just go round circles. So everything's always fresh in my mind. There are people that struggle with that and get overwhelmed. There are people that will just sit there and paint one thing religiously until that project is done. Now, I wish I had that level of willpower and kind of constraint in my hobby, but when Tim is your gaming buddy, he is a terrible, terrible influence in uh, hobby projects. Every time I go, oh, let's play a game at the club, he will come up with something completely different to play with. The most recent one being the Silver Bayonet. Great game. Obviously, already spent loads of money putting together a warband or two for that. Now, that has the scale of the game being, like a little crew-based game. It's a great way to cover something that you wouldn't necessarily normally do, but it allows you to kind of just dip your toe into that kind of era faction And skirmish games are a great way in general of doing that. Now, there is countless medieval kind of engagements that interest me that I would never be able to commit to doing a big Hail Caesar sized army for. But looking at games like Saga or Baron's War, for example, allow me to have a small retinue, a small project that I can be like, great, I've done that. And it kind of allows me to scratch that itch and indulge. But it's also a finite kind of project, whereas I know it's only going to be 30, 40 models, maybe a few more, and then that project is done. And then I can be like, right, it's finished. I'm happy with it. I've got it to play with, and you always get enjoyment of playing with those armies on the tabletop. The hard work and effort might seem terrible, overwhelming at times. I mean, just look at Mr. Crew over at Tremontium Hobbies with his love of Prussians. But we all know when he gets to the end of his Prussian army, he's going to enjoy playing many great games on the tabletop. And he loves them so much, he's also doing Portuguese now, which I've been hearing slight rumblings and complaints about how he does not like painting those either. So who knows, perhaps the Portuguese are the new Prussians for Mr. Crew. Although, from what I've seen, he is doing a cracking, quick and easy job on those. So I better get started with my Russians for the event, otherwise I will end up having to paint Prussians. And I would not want to rob him of the opportunity to paint more of them. So obviously I want him to be doing the forfeit, not me. So, congratulations to you all for making it this far. I do question your sanity, although I am incredibly grateful for your support. And just to quickly recap my thought processes, stages without all the rambling, we're going to have the initial idea, we're going to question the depth or level of your interest, we're going to look at the versatility of it, and then we're going to look at the rules that will suit it, whether it's a skirmish game or large scale kind of block game. And then we will look at whether you are prepared to do both sides or whether you just want it to be a collection. You're going to also look at your kind of player pool, whether you've got friends that will play it with you, or whether you want it to be an introductory kind of thing for other people. Then we're going to look at the size and how you envisage your army before looking at the availability and cost. And then the final stage would obviously be the effort and enjoyment level of it. Now, I will apologise for the crazy ramblings of myself, and hopefully I will see you all again in the next one. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy your hobby.